This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Merry Christmas and welcome to this Christmas Day edition of NC Spin. We hope you and yours had a wonderful season filled with all the best, and we thank you for spending time with us. Let's introduce this week's panel. Becki Gray with the John Locke Foundation, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and political consultant and otherwise observer in politics, Brad Crone. Easy for me to say. Last week we promised to give you a parting look at the big stories of 2016 and name our NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year, and we're going to do that next week. But so much has been going on, we feel compelled to discuss developing events. We want to begin by talking about the legislature's special session and what fallout it might have. Plus, we want to discuss the repeal of HB2, and of course, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. In a surprise move, the Charlotte City Council met last Monday and repealed their bathroom ordinance that set off the events leading to HB2. For months, there have been rumors about a compromise deal, but they never materialized. Meanwhile, behind-the-scenes maneuvering never stopped, and in a surprise move, as we say, Charlotte rescinded their bathroom ordinance conditioned on the legislature meeting in special session and fully repealing HB2 prior to December 31st. The governor called the lawmakers back into another special session this past Wednesday to consider the repeal. Governor-elect Roy Cooper said full repeal will help to bring jobs, sports, and entertainment events back and will provide the opportunity for strong LGBT protections for our state. Brad, at first it seemed like the long saga of HB2 would be quickly repealed, but it became evident as the day wore on last Wednesday it wasn't a slam dunk. As a matter of fact, there was so much divisiveness, none of the caucuses in either of the House or the Senate were able to come up with a compromise solution, and they adjourned with no repeal of HB2. What happened?
They adjourned sine die, so we won't see this issue for another couple of weeks. It was disappointing. It was downright despicable in the sense that the elected leaders of this state could not sit down and reason in good faith and in trusting each other to address an issue that's hurting our state economically, that's sending the wrong message when it comes to discrimination against the LGBT community. It was about trust. It was about the fact that Speaker Moore could not get, the Speaker has a rule that you have to have a majority of the Republican conference to vote a measure onto the floor. The Speaker could have forced the measure onto a floor, but it would threaten his political future as Speaker in the future on the upcoming vote when they reconvene. So it's just very disappointing.
But Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger had the same kind of problem, didn't he, Becki?
Well, apparently he did, and as Wednesday unfolded, we saw that they were in session, they were out of session, they were in session, out of session, and Senator Berger tried to get it through many different ways. The bill that he introduced was a repeal bill with a moratorium on it to, as Brad has talked about, this is a complicated issue. It's a very emotional issue. Senator Berger's suggestion was, let's take some time, let's have a cooling off period, let's really look at it, let's get cooler heads together in a room and figure out the best way to go forward. He split that bill into two votes, and it failed in a very surprising result.
John, as has been said, there was all kinds of finger pointing and blame gaming going on throughout the course, and we also had schisms taking place within caucuses. We had urban-rural divides. We had Democrat-Republican partisanship taking place. Is that what ultimately sunk the repeal?
I think there were many different factors that contributed to the ineffectiveness of the session. You could see things going awry right from the beginning because Governor-elect Cooper made some claims about his role in negotiating the deal that the Republican leaders in the legislature immediately rejected that they were true. And then what I knew something was going to go wrong is when I saw the Human Rights Campaign, the LGBT group, put out a statement about the Charlotte action. Of course, they didn't really like the fact that Charlotte had nullified its already legally meaningless ordinance as a kind of a gesture of good faith to get the conversation going. And what the Human Rights Campaign and other groups said is, look, fine, We'll just take other communities in North Carolina. They will immediately pass the same kind of ordinances in 2017, and we'll just start this ball rolling again. That's probably the main thing that led the lawmakers to think we're just being taken advantage of. We need a moratorium. Then that made the Democrats withdraw their support from the repeal bill. I mean, it just all unraveled.
Brad says, Chris, that this is sort of a black eye for our legislature, not being able to get this repeal passed.
Well,
what are the ramifications?
Well, I think there's a lot of losers. I think North Carolina is a loser. But, look, there was a lot of blame saying, well, that Cooper and the Democrats could have had this deal earlier this year, and they could have done it, and they played politics with it. Here's what I know. The city of Charlotte, unequivocally, on Wednesday morning, they went back and repealed everything. There was no question they repealed every single part of that ordinance everybody objected to. The deal was they would do that, and the General Assembly would then repeal HB2 because that's what caused it.
And they had said all along they didn't trust the legislature.
Right, but they did it. They repealed the whole thing, and then you can say you can blame anybody you want, but the Republicans, the last time I looked, had a supermajority in the House, a supermajority in the Senate, and the governor's mansion. So to say that the Democrats, even Roy Cooper at that point, played any role is absurd. The Republicans run state government. The Charlotte Democrats on the city council did their part of the deal. The Republicans in the General Assembly couldn't make their part of the deal happen, so that means we still have HB2 over our heads in North Carolina.
And Brad, the national TV networks were all over this, and North Carolina just got some horrendous publicity once again.
Really bad ink for the state. It's bad ink from the business environment because it allows businesses who are looking to North Carolina to locate here an acceptable reason to look to South Carolina, to look to Tennessee, to look to the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's a big stain. I think there will be a lot of pressure over the next 2 weeks for the Republicans to come back and to try and reset and to show the nation and show the world that we are a better state than this, that we don't discriminate against people.
I think that's an absolutely critical point. This special session last week went nowhere. But this issue is not dead. The issue of repeal is not dead. It's coming back in a few weeks. This is going to be a big issue in 2017. There are some Republicans who think, great, this is a great issue for us. We're going to talk about this for months. Other Republicans are rolling their eyes. I think that Chris is right about the city of Charlotte was distrusted by the legislature. So they did everything that was asked. What I think happened is legislators began to think, well, Charlotte's done that, but we've been told that this is not a deal. That once we repeal House Bill 2, some other city will immediately do all the same stuff that we objected to before, and so why should we repeal it? There is still a lack of trust, maybe not with the city of Charlotte anymore, but in general, and it's got to be Democrats and Republicans talking through how to address these issues and figure out some ways forward that can make most people comfortable on both sides.
But what didn't make any sense about the moratorium issue on Wednesday was that the Democrats and the HRC is opposed to a moratorium. Well, in the future, the legislature can come back and pass a moratorium.
That's true.
So I don't understand the argumentation there.
I think what really set that off is when this news email and newsletter went out from Equality North Carolina that said, as soon as they repeal HB2, we're going to put into place those exact same kind of provisions in cities across North Carolina. And there was a tremendous amount, but this is behind the Democrats, this is behind the HRC, and you talk about trust. I mean, that's what set all of this off.
Yeah, but
the General Assembly
y'all
felt
are just showing some more of the finger pointing, the blaming that's going on here.
We're saying that there are lots of different people in the story on both sides that have failed to figure out a solution.
Right.
This is not so much finger pointing as is making a list.
And one of the real solutions is not anything about bathrooms. It's about whether or not you can fire somebody or deny them services because they're gay. That is the biggest thing the LGBT community wants. And it's astounding that we can't have a rational discussion about that. The Republican caucus in the House, the majority of them doesn't want to do that.
And why can't you pass an anti-discrimination policy?
Exactly right.
For all classes.
Because there is still the concern, and there may not be very many people affected, but should a fundamentalist Christian baker or florist be compelled as a condition for doing business that they help celebrate same-sex marriages? They don't want to be compelled to do that. Unless you have an exception from an anti-discrimination ordinance, they will be their business.
That's existing case law.
Becki has politely been waiting to get a word in edgewise.
The other part of this that we haven't really discussed today is the concern in the issue that cities and counties are the creature and the creation of the General Assembly. And this whole HB2 thing, the whole thing that Charlotte did was they were not authorized to do that. And so there's a real concern that we pull back, that the General Assembly pulls back on the way that our state is set up. And if you want to change that, you've got to change the state constitution, and maybe that needs to be the starting point for this conversation.
And it looks like we're going to continue this conversation in the year 2017. As we come to the end of another year in our 947th show, we want to pause and give thanks to so many of you who watch and listen to us each week. Your kind comments and loyalty keep us going and have been affirmed by a recent study showing that 65% of politically active North Carolinians depend on NC Spin for balanced debate regularly. We also want to thank our cadre of panelists who are the ones who, week in and week out, work hard to get behind-the-scenes information and give you their comments on issues of interest to our state. And we can't let the opportunity pass without thanking the sponsors that underwrite and keep this program on the air each week. So thank you, everyone, for 18 wonderful years of support for NC Spin. We come back, we're going to talk about another special session.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The slogan on our family farm is growing the next generation. It means using innovative technology to conserve water and increase yields. It embodies our passion for providing food and fiber for our neighbors near and far. It represents our desire to take care of our employees, our land, and to leave a better place for our children. Farm life isn't easy, but it's a good life, and I love what I do.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Last week we told you the legislature had called itself into a second special session, and we went on to review what they did and how it's going to impact us going forward. There were two consequential pieces of legislation that passed. The first, Senate Bill 4, reconfigures the state board and county boards of elections, creates a new oversight board with new responsibilities, and guarantees partisan Supreme Court elections. But the more controversial legislation was HB 17, the bill that made dramatic changes in the State Board of Education and also reined in the appointive and hiring powers of Governor-elect Roy Cooper. I want to ask each of you, there's been widespread discussion about the need for HB 17. Democrats claim this was the action of sore-tailed losers who wanted to diminish the power of the incoming Democratic governor. Republican lawmakers said the executive branch had grown too powerful, and this was merely restoring the balance of power to the legislature. What say you, Chris?
I say that this is one of the more outrageous things I've seen in quite a while. They actually, I've never seen a session where they told so many falsehoods. We literally had members of the House saying, we're trying to be transparent here about a session about hurricane relief, and they knew they were already calling another special session. They misrepresented the facts. This clearly was a power grab. That if the executive branch was out of control, why did they wait until Roy Cooper got elected to change it?
All right, Becki, which was it? Power grab or rebalancing the deck?
Probably a little bit of everything. We heard from Republicans that this had been done before, that it was done when Republicans were elected under Democrat leadership in the General Assembly with Governor Holshouser, with Governor Martin, with Lieutenant Governor Jim Gart, a lot of Jims in there. So this reset, this relooking at things with the new administration was not something new.
Brad, what do you say?
Well, it's a power grab, but I agree with what Becki said. You got to understand the context of the history of our state and the appreciation that our legislature's been the most powerful body from a political standpoint since 1796. And Becki, you're right, 1973, 1985, 1989, Democrats stripped the Republicans coming into power.
But John, was it a case where the executive branch had grown too powerful? I mean,
No. On the other hand, lawmakers genuinely do think that the governorship is too powerful. Remember, they did go after Governor McCrory on some matters. This has gone to the Supreme Court. It wasn't just about that particular matter of the Coal Ash Commission. On a number of other fronts, there were some conflicts. But there's no question that a prospect of a Democratic governor coming in probably definitely made those Republican lawmakers even more intent to constrain gubernatorial power.
There was some question about whether the Governor McCrory was going to sign this legislation into law, since he had previously taken that same legislature to court for separation of powers between the branches, but he signed it. How did he justify considering it what most consider the weakest executive branch in the nation?
Right. Well, he really made two significant comments about it, and you're right. We waited several days until he signed that, so there was some question as to whether he was. But number one, he said that he felt like a lot of the accusations of Roy Cooper's power being taken away from him was overblown in the press, and so he kind of dismissed that part of it. But he did address the Senate confirmation of agency heads and said the General Assembly can work that out with Roy Cooper.
I don't know how you overblow the fact that he stripped the governor.
No, I don't either. I mean, there were a lot of appointments, everything from the Charter School Advisory Board. You mentioned the confirmation of
UNC boards.
UNC boards. I thought it was fascinating that one of the things they complained about, and folks have mentioned in 1988 or 1889, they stripped the lieutenant governor's legislative powers and gave it to the Senate President pro tem. Well, if they were so worried about it, why didn't they take the powers away from Phil Berger and give it back to Dan Forrest and fix the historic wrong?
Yeah, one of the more controversial sections, Brad, involves stripping power from the State Board of Education, giving more power to the superintendent. The State Board called a meeting this past Tuesday and went into closed session to discuss this. I think some legal action is going to be forthcoming. What's your take on it?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I would not be a bit surprised to see the State Board of Education and incoming Governor Roy Cooper take legal action and maybe join up to take it through Superior Court and then Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court.
John, if you look at our state constitution, Article 9, Section 4, subparagraph 2 says, the State Board of Education shall supervise and administer the free public school system and the educational funds provided for its support, and make all needed rules and regulation in regard thereto, subject to laws enacted by the General Assembly. And the superintendent of public instruction shall be the Secretary and Chief Administrative Officer of the State Board of Education. That seems pretty clear-cut to me.
Chief Administrative Officer, Tom, what does that mean?
Of the State Board of Education?
Yes.
Yes.
So
it says that the superintendent administers the policy.
Remember that this has been litigated to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court does not agree with you. They said the superintendent has actual authority that isn't just subservient to the State Board of Education. I'm not going to defend any of these. I think some of these policies are reasonable. Some of the things they did in the special session were fine with me. Right. Some of them I'm not sure about, but I know that there wasn't enough time in this special session right before Christmas to debate all of the consequences and implications of all these changes. I wish they had done them in a different way. And I think that part of it, those objections are valid, that this was done too quickly in not the right setting.
Becki, very quickly before we end this topic, reducing the governor's powers for political hires or exempt employees from 1,500, which Governor McCrory had gotten the legislature to pass, back to 425.
Well, back to 425, I think, is the key point there, that for years, the governor's appointees were in the neighborhood of 300 to 400. And, what is the right amount? I don't know. The General Assembly said when Governor McCrory took over, state government's broken. He needs a lot of help to get it fixed. He's fixed it. Now it's back to 425.
All right. After these messages, we're going to continue this discussion by talking about Senate Bill 4.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue reviewing the actions of the second special session from a week or so ago. Senate Bill 4 contains a number of provisions. It reconfigures the state board and county boards of elections, creates a new oversight board with new responsibilities, and guarantees partisan Supreme Court elections. But it also combines the functions of election campaign finance, lobbying, and ethics disclosures under a new board. John, if this was such a desirable move, why didn't the legislature deal with it in this year's past short session, or even wait until 2017 when the session convenes? Why?
Because they were reacting to the election of Roy Cooper, which would have changed the control of the Elections Board. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. I'm intrigued by this idea. I'm really not sure what I think about all the aspects of this. Some of it does have precedent in the Federal Elections Commission being similarly situated, but putting all these roles into one board, having the board be an even number, requiring a supermajority to act, I think has implications. Both that supermajority requirement is in existence for the new state board and all the county boards. And I think that has implications that we have yet to understand. Now, one thing I want to say about this, again, I wish that had been handled in long session or some lengthier period of time to discuss it. But this is another case. I was puzzled by some reporters who seem not to know this. But in 1970, after the 72 election and after the 84 election, when 2 Republican governors were elected, the Democratic legislature absolutely refused to allow them to control the election system. They refused to allow them to hire their own elections director. So this very much had precedent in the past, whatever you think of it.
Chris, what do you think about this new oversight board that combines ethics and takes authority away from the Secretary of State on registering?
Yeah, well, that's not an accident either. You know, the Secretary of State's currently a Democrat, as we know, Elaine Marshall. Most of this, I think, was partisanly motivated. That doesn't mean all of it's a bad idea. I agree with John a little bit. Some of this I am intrigued by, seeing how it's going to work, but there's so many things in this. First of all, the process was absurd. We're literally restructuring our elections on the fly with no notice in a day and a half, or whatever. That's outrageous. And it's also interesting, of course, they changed who chairs the State Board of Elections. The Democrats have it in the odd years. The Republicans have it in the even years. Well, elections for the legislature, Congress, and the president are in the even years. So there's so many partisan aspects to this that it almost makes it impossible to evaluate. I wish we had appointed a study commission and taken 6 months or a year to look at this and come up with some recommendations.
Well, and another provision of this, Brad, was any contested cases regarding elections are going to be heard by the full 15-member Court of Appeals. Traditionally, they just have 3 judge panels. Why have 15 board members?
Because
they have the control over
nothing is safe or sacred when the legislature's in town, as my old boss Jim Graham used to say. And you know, it goes back to the fact that the Court of Appeals has a Republican majority right now, and it is partisan. And the Republicans always amaze me because they get in trouble when they rush legislation through. I mean, what we've seen over the last 2 weeks is a sad state of affairs for the state of North Carolina.
Brad, you did miss the one sly part of that particular move, and that's something that needs to be understood. That has been proposed before. The idea of allowing the Court of Appeals to meet en banc, the way the federal Court of Appeals does, has been proposed before in the North Carolina legislature by Senator Roy Cooper.
In a regular session.
I understand,
yeah.
But that's one of the reasons they did this, because it was Cooper's original idea.
Becki, I want to. One of the things that we witnessed during both the session this past week and the one the week before, a lot of protests taking place over the General Assembly. More than 30 people were arrested. Comment on people's right to protest and when it gets out of control.
That's a really good question. There were a lot of protesters there. They were very loud. They were very disruptive. Now, let me preface this by saying First Amendment freedom of speech is incredibly important, whether, no matter whether you agree with me or not, those are very important. But, there's repercussions for those. And, I'll give you an example of one of them. Close to 400 school children were not allowed to visit the General Assembly because the protesters and the adults with the school children felt like it posed an unsafe situation. So there's consequences to these things.
All right. I want to issue a program note for our viewers in the Wilmington area. Beginning Saturday, January 6th, NC Spin will be airing at a new time on WILM television. I want you to be sure to tune in NC Spin Saturday, starting January 6th at our new time at 8 a.m. A lot of people have been saying that we were on the air too early there. Well, 8 a.m. is a better air time. When we come back, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
Each week we ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. Brad Crone, we'll start with you.
Well, Tom, a lot of back channel work going on during House Bill 2 special session last week. Most impressive was the business community really working with the leadership on both sides of the aisle to try and get a repeal.
John, tell us something we don't know.
In 2017, during the legislative session, look for the state health plan to be a significant issue. Dale Falwell, the new state treasurer, talked about changing the health plan to make it more attractive for dependent coverage. Lawmakers of both parties appear to be interested in discussing that.
Good. Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
I think one of the big issues will be the continuing battle over regulation and funding of charter schools. Remember, the Republicans, we talked about the State Board of Education, it's controlled now by Republicans. A lot of Republicans don't think they've been cooperative enough, which is why they took their power away.
Becki Gray, tell us something we don't know.
Something else to look for in 2017, and an issue that has been thoroughly studied by the Courts Commission will have to do with juveniles and at what point they go to juvenile prison or go to housed with adults.
All right. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this Christmas Day edition of NC Spin. As we close this year, we want you to see a picture and read the names of the men and women who work behind the scenes each week to make us all look and sound good. We thank them and wish them all the best as we move into 2017. Merry Christmas to you, and we hope invite you back next week as we look ahead to the end of the year 2016 and the top stories. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.